Plants and climate change education is all about exploring how botanic gardens and arboreta can maximize the impact of plant-centered climate change education. So these online place conversations that we're doing are open to our public gardens community to really learn about climate change education models, ideas, and really think together with colleagues about how they apply to the work that we do in public gardens. We are thrilled to be joined by today's guest presenters who are representing the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, or NOCI. With more than a decade of success, NOCI is widely recognized as the United States' leading climate change interpretation training program. NOCI has partnered on dozens of peer-reviewed publications that describe its unique combination of elements for training and highlighting the network's outcomes. The Marine Mammal Center currently serves as the fiscal sponsor for NOCI's work. And then we have three speakers today representing NOCI. One speaker change for this program that I want to highlight for folks. Unfortunately, Stephanie Cadaval is not able to join us, but we are so happy that Kate Bergenthal was able to step in her place. And so I'll introduce each of these speakers, starting with Kate. Kate Bergenthal is the NOCI project coordinator under fiscal sponsorship of the Marine Mammal Center, which is the world's largest marine mammal hospital. Kate joined NOCI in 2015 and previously held the same position under the program's original home, the New England Aquarium. Although she resides in Boston, Kate grew up in Miami. She received her Master of Professional Studies degree in Marine Conservation from the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science. Joining Kate, we have Alyssa Shute. She is the program manager for the Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative at the University of Vermont. She is also president of the board of directors for NOCI, which she joined in 2021, first as vice president. She works with the board to create systems infrastructure for NOCI and strategically plan for the future. She has completed the NOCI Crash Course program. And then finally, we'd like to welcome Karen Willey. Karen is a naturalist and retired environmental educator who works in Asheville, North Carolina, and works remotely for Sarasota Audubon in Florida. She creates the Sarasota Audubon newsletter and moderates their monthly Zoom meetings. Karen trained with NOCI in a 2013 study circle and returned in 2018 to participate in a NOCI leadership training camp. After that, she joined the communications committee and has been working within the NOCI network ever since. Welcome, Kate, Alyssa, and Karen. Thanks for being here.
All right, well, let's get started and ready for the next slide. Welcome, and our hope today is to introduce you to a different approach for climate communication. We will only begin to cover this unique approach, but hope that it can inspire new thoughts and techniques for you as you go into conversations with others around climate change. We will also provide guidance for ways to engage with NOCI further. Next slide. Okay, trying to get there. All right, so why do we need to talk about climate change? Americans who think global warming is happening outnumber those who think it is not happening by a ratio of 5-to-1, or 74%. Now, these numbers are coming from the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication from their most recent research paper, which came out in this past spring. So in addition, 66% say they are rarely or never discuss climate change with family and friends. And this is actually a higher number than the 2021 study. So we need to get talking, guys. 34% say they only talk about climate change occasionally. 52% of people say they hear about global warming in the media at least once a week, but only 23% say that they hear people they know talk about climate change at least once a month. Next slide. So our opportunity is that NOCI represents over 360 organizations in 43 states, and you all in public gardens welcomed over 120 million visitors in 2022. Each one of us is part of a powerful network, and the more we can normalize the conversation and use impactful language across our audiences, the more we can build support and action. Next slide. So when we think about what our audience is receiving about climate change in the news and in the media, what emotional or intellectual feelings are they getting? A lot of what they're seeing is embedded in doom and gloom. But when we lead with fear and crisis, it leads to short-term responses. We can argue that's not what we want for climate communications. We want behavior change. We want a culture change, which takes a different mindset. So, using the principles of the National Association of Interpretation and other communication tools to lead people to something that is hopeful, inspiring, and empowering. That's what we want to introduce to you, a strategically framed approach rooted in hope and solutions. So our goal at Noki is to train enough voices in proven communication techniques to shift the national conversation about climate change to be more positive and civic-minded. Today, we will introduce you to tested tools that you can add to your tool belt and empower you to engage in solutions-focused, hopeful climate change dialogue. Next. So we've got a problem, which is people not talking about climate change. And we've got an opportunity, which is the massive reach and public trust that we see in our audience that we face. So how do we change the conversation? Noki has a suite of programs that we offer to climate communicators around the country, ranging from self-paced online materials, intensive online crash courses, and a multi-month trainer program. And Alyssa has put in the chat a link that will take you to some of these, this information. But now we're going to set the stage and give you a little background. Emily's going to play us a video that will provide an overview of the Noki approach.
The National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, known as Noki, is a committed group of informal science educators who are changing the conversation on climate change. Rather than doom and gloom, they're focused on hope and civic action. Educators at aquariums, zoos, and museums facilitate millions of conversations each year, but climate conversations weren't happening because science educators were unsure of how to guide them productively in a family-oriented setting. Thanks to funding from the National Science Foundation, a partnership was formed between climate scientists, informal science educators, and social scientists to create a training program for interpreters at aquariums, zoos, nature centers, and parks. The program worked with strategic framing, an empirical approach to science translation to help interpreters in their work and in their conversations with friends, family, and colleagues. The Noki program launched in 2011 and has been refined as the network grew. Program evaluations have found that our alumni develop more confidence in their ability to explain climate science, increasing their willingness to discuss climate concepts. Noki language increased people's understanding of climate change, their support for solutions, and commitment to civic engagement, and we've shown that strategic framing can turn concerned individuals into active and engaged citizens. By July 2017, over 400 colleagues from 170 institutions in 38 states had joined our community, and our community is reporting consistent improvements in its own effectiveness. Using innovation, collaboration, and empirical inquiry, Noki has launched a growing network of climate interpreters with tools that help millions of Americans understand why our climate is changing and motivate them to get started on solutions in their community.
Okay, next slide. So where do we start? Communicators fall into the same trap sometimes. We forget that a lot of how the message is received depends on what is already in someone's head. This has implications for our work. Knowing how someone might process the information they receive can help us craft the story of climate change to be most effective. Next slide. So we're going to try an example. If you search the word ocean in Google Images, you get these photos. And I want you to notice what they have in common. And if you do me a favor and type that in the chat, what you see in these images that looks similar. They're clean. They're blue, aquamarine, clean looking water, blue water, all bright and beautiful. Its surface, dramatic blues, calming blues, light, sky, water, bright, clear skies, waves, empty, without plastic, true. All right, good. So the vast majority, as we see, focus on the colors and the beautiful light at the surface, and it depicts only water. There are no animals present except a few have those charismatic megafauna. It's no accident that these images are so similar. This tells us something about how our culture thinks about the ocean, what the models are that we have in mind, and how we understand them. Our mental shortcut about oceans includes the ideas that the ocean is all on the surface and it is mostly water. So this is an example of what anthropologists call a cultural model. And there are multiple cultural mindsets or models on any given topic or issue. These mindsets are widely shared, they are durable, and they structure our thinking. Next slide. So cultural mindsets are built over time through repeated interactions with people, institutions, and media. Think of the brain as a field of tall grass that you see in the picture. If you walk through that field once, the grass will pop right back up and the field doesn't change. But if you walk through the field the same way again and again, a path is created. And the same thing happens in our brains with repeated exposures to ideas. That's how learning happens. Culture is learned. Cognitive scientists have a term for the places in our brains where many paths come together, and they call these schemas. Cultural mindsets are schemas that are passed on from person to person until most or even all people within a group are familiar with them. They are created and reinforced when we interact with others and share the same experiences as others in society, including things like literature, formal education, television shows, or even games. New experiences are interpreted through old schemas. Once a path is there, you're likely to go down the established path rather than walking off the path. Cultural mindsets are important because we need to take into account the information that people are bringing with them to a communication. Cultural mindsets have implications for how we plan the content of our communications about climate change. We know where we want to end up, so knowing where you're starting with your audience is key to planning the best messaging. Next slide. So, knowing that there is a default thinking about oceans, what about for climate and carbon dioxide? Here is one example of a misconception. In the cartoon on the left, the husband is asking, why don't those greenhouse gases escape through the hole in the ozone layer? So what are some of the misconceptions that you hear about climate change? I'd like you to think of one or two of the more common ones that spring to mind. And don't press enter, but please type them in the chat box. Again, don't press enter quite yet. I'm going to give you a minute to type a common misconception that you hear about climate change. what we're going to do, don't push enter. We're going to do a waterfall of misconceptions. So everybody is pushing it at once. Okay? All right, when I say 3, 1, 2, 3, enter. Okay, now let me go back and see what our misconceptions are. It can't be stopped. Water temperatures are good. Climate change is natural. Climate change isn't real. This is just the Earth getting warm and it doesn't include weather events. How can global warming be real if the winters are still cold? Do you see this? These cultural norms, the things that we're seeing are all very similar. It's too big a problem for individuals to solve. It's natural. Confusion on weather versus climate. See, these are all great. Too late to fix, out of people's control at this point, natural variation over time. Lots of misconceptions. So, a key element of strategic framing is understanding the default thinking or cultural mindsets associated within the topic. So now we're going to show you another video. This one is a little longer, and it was created by our partner Frameworks Institute and interviews people on the street about regular versus rampant carbon dioxide.
As part of a larger, more comprehensive investigation to find out how the public thinks about carbon dioxide and its role in climate change, Frameworks researchers conducted rapid interviews with ordinary Americans in locations across the country. So let's take a look at what this looks like in some excerpts from our on-the-street interviews, a rapid response research technique that Frameworks uses to confirm and visualize the findings of more in-depth research on public thinking.
What role do you think that carbon dioxide or CO2, what role does that play in the climate?
Very bad one.
Gosh, this is awful. I should know all this stuff.
Give me a definition if you don't mind.
That's what you exhale, right? Trees absorb it.
Think of trees, like processing carbon dioxide usually.
Isn't that like the car exhaust?
The fumes out of a car.
Car exhaust.
If you leave a car on in a garage, the carbon dioxide will go inside that car.
I don't know. I think trees absorb it, we exhale it. It's not good for us to inhale, but it's good for plant life.
So what do you think happens if there's too much carbon dioxide on the planet?
That means everybody's gonna die. We gonna all suffocate.
The impact, if there was a massively, like too much, it could impact our health in general. I don't know if too much of it could also negatively impact plant life.
I don't know, probably like greenhouse gases or something like that.
Something about the ozone, I think.
Well, it affects the ozone layer greatly. Everybody's saying the greenhouse effect, global warming.
It like puts a hole in the ozone.
It's breaking down the ozone? I think it's the one that's doing that. I'm not sure.
I think it disrupts the ozone layer.
People were unable to easily reconcile carbon dioxide's role in respiration and photosynthesis with its role in climate change. To explain the harmful role of anthropogenic CO2, Frameworks developed and tested the taxonomy of regular versus rampant carbon dioxide. This helps distinguish between the CO2 that is necessary and CO2 buildup that is problematic. Researchers read this passage aloud and then asked participants follow-up questions about carbon dioxide, as well as some of the broader causes and consequences of climate change. Let's listen to how this way of framing information about the effects of CO2 worked to help participants distinguish between beneficial and harmful levels of carbon dioxide.
Yeah, from what I'm getting, regular is just the standard. If there was no influx of carbon dioxide, regular is just the equilibrium. It's I breathe out, plant breathes in on a cycle. And then the rampant is if, two people breathe out and there's only one plant, the plant only needs the one breath, in a very, very simple analogy.
We're producing more carbon dioxide than a normal life cycle or environment would naturally, just as humans produce it and the environment consumes it, plants consume it, and it's just building up.
Carbon dioxide's a part of life. We need some of it, but we currently have way too much in the environment.
We have to find a way of lessening this rampant carbon dioxide that we're putting out.
Oh, you want to get rid of the rampant if you can, as much as possible.
More carpooling, more buses, more public transit, more bikes, just things that we can control in our everyday lives, things that are very simple that we just don't do.
Find alternative fuels, lessen the emissions of the carbon dioxide that we're putting into the air.
There are things we need to start sacrificing and changes we need to make, or else it's just going to keep getting out of control.
The rampant carbon dioxide is just like the excess carbon dioxide that we're producing that like human beings weren't always producing, so it's like not natural.
That there's more of it than is necessary for just normal life, not just human life, but plant life, life in general.
Naturally in the world, there is carbon dioxide, and there needs to be a certain level just to keep every process, photosynthesis and everything else we need. We are going to exhale carbon dioxide, that's going to happen. But now that there's too much of it, it's throwing the balance of everything off in the environment.
This taxonomy offers a way of organizing pieces of knowledge which otherwise might seem to conflict. Also, use of alliteration reinforces the idea that these two concepts are a contrasting pair, which helps distinguish between what is common knowledge about carbon dioxide and its role in trapping heat in the planet's atmosphere. This latter information enables thinking about impacts and consequences, including connections to other phenomena like ocean acidification. This framing tool's ability to establish a sound causal understanding and to head off dominant misconceptions likely to arise otherwise about carbon dioxide was qualitatively and quantitatively tested with nearly 3,000 Americans.
Okay, so we know a couple of things don't match up. Americans do care about climate change and its impact on oceans, but they have no idea how it works or what to do about it. And the bottom line is this. If people don't know what carbon dioxide gas is or what the role is in climate and ocean change, they aren't going to generate productive ideas about what to do about it. So, how do we craft messages and engage in productive conversations that will navigate away from the unproductive cultural mindsets and inspire understanding and hope? Enter strategic framing. It is a research-based approach that is proven to bridge the gap between scientists and public understanding. Strategic framing helps the public understand the mechanisms of climate change, and it shows the public how they can be the heroes of the climate change story. It includes a set of recommended communications elements that, when used together, allow us to strategically navigate our way toward the biggest impact. And it will leave the audience and the communicator with a sense of hope. Okay, turning it over to Kate.
Thank you so much, Karen, for giving us the base so far. So you'll see this a couple times throughout the presentation. This is what we refer to as creating a story, a core story of climate change. You'll hear us use the word story sometimes. We're not necessarily saying you sit down and talk to a 5-year-old your bedtime story. This is giving people all of the pieces that they need to understand how we go from burning heat trapping gases to going toward the understanding of there are solutions that we can take to have hope and action on climate. So we talked about mind reading, but how do we navigate people to productive ways of thinking about climate change? So we need to build them this picture. So we need to change the story. It's not that climate change is real, we're all going to die, didn't you see that flood? It's a lot of pieces. Climate change is not one distinct thing. So we want to help the public fill in those missing cognitive holes so that we can all get on the same page and work together to improve the situation. So when you think of your story, whatever that might be, you want to think of these 3 parts. Why does it matter? Why should this person that I'm talking to or writing to care about what it is that we're talking about? How does it work? You saw those people in the video. They did not understand the mechanisms. They understood pieces, but they were not able to get that full picture of what those mechanisms were that climate change was coming from and what it creates, those impacts. We also want to leave people with a sense of ability to, what can I do about it? You don't want to leave someone and be like, well, there are these impacts. This is how it works. have a good day, it's not necessarily going to work that well in your favor. So we want to leave them feeling a sense of hope, efficacy, and agency about climate and ocean change. So whenever you talk about oceans and climate change, try and kind of ping back, or plants and climate change, to include these three pieces to your story. So we're going to move on to the next one. So why does this matter to society? You'll see our dear friend the Lorax on the side there, and it's very similar to this. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's simply not. So we know there are a million reasons why climate change matters. A lot of different reasons for all of us, but not all will move the public to act. Some actually turns people off. It's important to frame climate change as an issue that aligns with something people already care about, so that it doesn't have to compete for interest and time with other issues in their lives. A way to kind of think about this that I like to use is, if someone doesn't have all the pieces, they're less likely to do something about it. So I use the example of baking a cake. If somebody has never baked a cake before in their lives, they're likely not going to go and make their best friend's wedding cake. They need someone to show them how to be able to utilize the flour and the sugar and the eggs and all these things to get to their output. We can't just assume that people know what climate change is, how it works, and how it relates to things. So research by the Frameworks Institute that we talked about before, they were our psychologists and linguists that do a lot of this work with us, found that two value frames were the strongest and most reliable ways of making the case for meaningful changes in line with scientific consensus. This was done with North Americans throughout all of North America, adult audiences specifically, so just to keep in mind. So they know that if we all work to emphasize these, our impact will be amplified, as repetition is powerful. I'm sure if you've heard Baby Shark a million times, you probably know Baby Shark. We want that to be as climate change framing to be as salient in your lives as Baby Shark, and hopefully more so. So we're not saying that everyone has the same base values. Of course we don't. That can sound odd to some people, but what we assessed is that there are two values that resonated with everybody across the board. We do have shared values in certain things, and those two things happen to be protection and responsible management. Protection, who doesn't want to protect themselves and the people they care about? Responsible management, who doesn't want to make sure that they have the life that they want or their children want in the future? So we can go ahead on to the next slide. So we refer to these as our reframe cards. This is values that were tested by frameworks that allowed us to really tease out, why would this matter? Why does it care to people? So if we look at value protection, we're going to start with our first bullet point. We want to have a duty to safeguard the well-being of people and places. So we must protect and preserve the habitats and ecosystems we depend on. I'm sure a ton of you are already seeing how that relates to plants. Showing concern for others is the right thing to do, so making it not just about us. Stepping in to ensure people's safety and well-being. Hopefully, people don't want themselves or their neighbors to be hurt. Let's take measures to eliminate or reduce risks. And finally, let's be vigilant in shielding people and places from harm. So this value emphasizes the need to shield people from harm. You'll see that again and again. So it's stepping in to ensure people's safety. It's looking at risk reduction, concern for the welfare of others, and preserving habitats. So if you're talking about the habitat of certain types of trees, you might want to go to protection. Responsible management is our other one, and that's the idea of taking common sense steps today to act in the best interest of future generations. So this value stresses the importance of using common sense and step-by-step approaches to come up with responsible long-term plans that act in the interest of future generations. So we'll pull up our first bullet point. Let's be responsible when it comes to the environment. We know that we all have to use it. We know of the tragedy of the commons. Let's be responsible collectively for using it. Let's look ahead to handle problems before they get worse. We all know that if you let one thing go in your car and then the next thing goes, you want to handle it before it becomes an issue. That's the same across all of us. Responsible managers keep an open mind, look to evidence, and take a level-headed step-by-step approach. This is not the Kermit flailing your arms. This is making sure that we are having plans in place that take us from point A to point B. And then last but not least, future generations depend on the decisions we make today. So there is not a rule of thumb for which of the values you use in a communication. You can use both, but you want to make sure that you clearly convey both ideas instead of blending them halfway. So you want to talk about taking these common sense approaches step by step for future generations, while also protecting people and places that we care about from harm right now. You want to make sure you include all those pieces. So you cannot go wrong with either. We recommend trying both out many times to help you become more comfortable with them. I can say from experience, myself, Karen, Alyssa, we've all repeated and repeated and repeated these. It becomes like its own language in time. You just need practice with it. So eventually it will feel very natural to include this stuff in your climate communications. And we like to use these values early and often, meaning you want to start with a value, let people know what's at stake, and then you want to continue to repeat that so they continue to keep that salient in their minds. So go ahead and look at a couple values in action. So first off, we believe we need to protect our forest resources and increase trees in our urban environment to provide benefits to our community for the future. This might be a little tricky. Which value is this? Is this protection? Is this responsible management? Anyone in the chat? Oh, Rebecca's typing. Protection, both. Yes, it is protection, but it's also responsible management. And how do we see that? Because not only did we talk about protect our forest resources, but we're talking about providing benefits to our community for the future. So you're seeing both approaches, but it clearly provides both pieces. So totally cool to use both. The second one, it's important that we all take responsible steps to manage the issues facing our environment, to leave our planet in good shape for future generations of animals, plants, and people. Is that protection? Is that responsible management? I like people just RM, responsible management. Yes. So we know it's responsible management because we straight up say responsible steps. We refer to these cards as plagiarize them. And it sounds insane for somebody to be like, just plagiarize this. No, these values, the reframe cards for us were made for the fact of being able to use something that we know works and plug it into your work. So we can talk more about that a little later. But let's move on to the next part of our creating our core story of climate change. That is hard to say multiple times. So we have now talked about why does this matter? We know that the values of protection and responsible management resonate best with people in North American adult audiences. So now we want to talk about that. How does it work? Allowing someone to get from point A to point B, giving them that idea of regular versus rampant, so they can have the language to be able to convey their thoughts and ideas to other people. So we've talked about a lot of ways through Noki that we can make this information sticky and be able to stay in people's minds. So if we want to move on to our next slide. So how does this work? We know that if someone understands how something works, they're more likely to act. So making sure someone understands the mechanisms at work is really important. Knowing and understanding how something works is empowering. Going back to that boxed cake thing, if you have never made the boxed cake, you're not going to feel comfortable making that wedding cake. You need someone to walk you through that process. So traditionally, communication routinely backfires because we fail to take into account what people are already bringing with them to the issue. So in climate change, this may be a misunderstanding of carbon monoxide versus carbon dioxide. It could be a missense of understanding that heat trapping gases should just go through the hole in the ozone layer. Fun fact, if you talk to teens about the hole in the ozone layer, we've discovered over the last couple of years that most of them don't know about the hole in the ozone layer, which is great. Obviously, we're doing major steps towards that, and that shows us that solutions can be successful. But additionally, you can't assume that if you want to talk about the success of the bald eagle and DDT, or you want to talk about chlorofluorocarbons and the ozone layer, you can't assume everyone has the same information that you do. So framing helps us to avoid this problem by researching how people think and then coming up with ways to talk about an issue based on that research. If the problem is that people don't know how climate change works, then a tested explanatory metaphor or explanatory chain is a great tool to be able to teach that process. So I'm going to go on to our next one. So good explanations. What makes for a good explanation? They help people understand the mechanisms that work. If they don't understand the problem, they might struggle to identify the solution. Understandable. If I don't know what's wrong with my car, I don't know what's wrong with my car. I can't fix it. I need somebody else to. But if I learn, then I can work towards potentially fixing my car. I've been given the tools to do so. So when we make an abstract idea more concrete, it becomes sticky and people are able to remember it. So when we talk about climate change, if we do not connect the dots for people and they become unsure of how this SciCAD is dealing with climate change, they're just gonna kind of go off into the ether, not being able to understand what you said. So you want to fill in those cognitive holes that might be unproductive or misleading for them, or something that's been naturally ingrained in the culture. So we talked about all those things people naturally believe. Remember, when you talk to somebody, that might be where their mind is. So you want to help them navigate out of that and explain to them why that method of thinking is something that may not get them to a point that's going to be successful. So when we link the causes and impacts of an issue, it motivates people to think productively of multiple solutions. So a good explanation will have all of these components and function as what we like to call an effective explanatory chain. So a couple more slides with me before I turn it over to my good friend Alyssa. So we talked about explanatory metaphors. We unfortunately do not have time to dig into all of these. Typically, people take at least a 7-week course up to a 5-month course with us to be able to talk the talk and walk the walk fully. So this is a very quick dive in on it. But we have 4 explanatory metaphors that we typically use. One is dealing with our atmosphere and how heat trapping gases act as a heat trapping blanket. We'll talk about that next, more in depth. You heard about regular versus rampant carbon dioxide. And the 2 you will not hear about today, but we're happy to dive into should people have questions later, is how the ocean acts like the heart of the climate. We have to keep our heart healthy to make sure our climate stays regulated properly, as well as osteoporosis of the seas. This is talking about ocean acidification in relation to shells animals create and how it can be similar to osteoporosis in humans. So let's go ahead and move on to a better explanation of heat trapping blanket. So this metaphor makes some choices about what to emphasize and what to de-emphasize. It focuses on carbon dioxide buildup as the most significant factor contributing to temperature rise, and on the use of fossil fuels as what's adding the carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So by starting with the premise that the atmosphere is like a blanket that becomes thicker when carbon dioxide is added to it, the metaphor very quickly establishes that a hole in the ozone is not the problem. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Children know what blankets are. We now know from our research that children do understand this specific metaphor, because a blanket's something we all understand. You have too many blankets, you can't kick your feet out, it's going to get quite warm under there. So by introducing the idea that burning fossil fuels thickens the blanket, the model makes humans accountable for our actions. It pulls forward the idea that we have a shared fate with nature. So explaining how the carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels thickens a blanket, trapping in heat, contradicts the idea that change is natural or works in cycles. It shows a cause and effect. So putting all these ideas together, it's clear that only reducing our reliance on fossil fuels will help, and that recycling material pollution is not going to fix the problem on its own, as we often hear. What about plastics? So how does this look? What does this all look like in action? So we have values, metaphors, and explanations in action. So we have our checklist. We want to make sure that we are talking about the heat trapping blanket, talking about fossil fuels being the major underlying cause. We want to talk about the blanket is made up of heat trapping gas like carbon dioxide. We want to describe an impact of climate change, so you don't leave the impression that the climate and ocean being a little bit warmer is a good thing, and make it science-based. So, but we don't want to say scientists found, because we've realized that people in your positions as informal science educators are actually considered better resources and more believable and unbiased than scientists. As odd as that might sound, we're the most important factors in making these talks. So want to use a matter-of-fact tone, and we want to be concise. So we see that we believe we need to protect our forest resources and increase trees in our urban environment to provide benefits to our community or for the future. As we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas to power our lives, we are putting excessive amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This rampant excessive carbon dioxide is building up in the atmosphere and acting like a heat-trapping blanket, causing the earth to warm. As the climate warms, our cities can become increasingly hot. Planting trees in our cities can help cool the urban environment and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels to power that cooling while also absorbing some of the excessive carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Trees and people are part of the solution, and the Morton Arboretum is committed to providing tools, best practices, and learning opportunities to inspire action for trees. So if we move on to the next slide, you can see a little more broken down where we have these pieces we've talked about so far. So you can go ahead and click through, Alyssa. So you can see protect. That's our value. We're starting with the value early and often. Then we move it into clearly stating the big cause. We burn fossil fuels, and it adds to that. It's causing issues in our lives. We're talking about this heat trapping blanket. Then we move on to using a metaphor. So we want to be able to be really straightforward as we're trying to make benefits for our local ecosystems and how we do that with a metaphor. And then finally, what's the big problem? What's our big issue? And actually, I think there's one more bullet here, if you want to click, Alyssa. So we're connecting the dots and putting people into the picture. It's not just about the trees, because we don't know that everyone's going to care about the same trees and places that we might. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Alyssa to help us finish this core story of climate change.
Thank you so much, Kate. I always appreciate getting to listen to you give this presentation. So now that we've established the tools for answering the questions, why does it matter and how does it work, it's time to connect people to how they can help to improve the situation. We do this by connecting them to collective community-based solutions. And I want to say, please know that a community does not just mean our neighborhoods or our towns. Communities can come in many different forms, from schools, Facebook clubs, places of worship, your friends, or even this group that is here now with the U.S. Botanic Garden. By keeping this in mind, we can broaden our ability to look for good solutions with which many different people are engaged that make sense for their area. When we include community-level solutions in our story, we're telling people that concern for our climate is normal and action on climate is happening all around us. We can come together as community members to address climate change and help change the decision-making context so that the sustainable choice is the easy choice for more people. I also want to mention to not be afraid to align climate solutions to issues related to climate or environmental racism or social justice. Fence line communities are seeing impacts of climate change right now. You may have seen images early in the pandemic, and I'm just going to highlight this cartoon here of clear skies and empty streets and folks waxing poetic about how they wished it was always that way or how it would be great to get back to normal. A collective solutions approach thinks more about how our normal can be different with systems in place that support a community-wide reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. By framing the problem, explaining it, and linking the problem to the explanation and the direct effects felt by the community, we're empowering our audience with knowledge. When we then include community-level solutions, we give our audience context for making the sustainable choice the easy choice. Offering community-level solutions also fosters a sense of hope and engagement to our audience, giving them practical steps forward from a collective, informed, and engaged community. When you think of community-level solutions that you could use in a climate story, be specific with any programs, initiatives, or approaches that you offer so your audience is aware of those solutions exist in the community and how they can get involved. So there are 3 types of solutions. We want to focus on carbon dioxide emissions. So programs and actions that will reduce or eliminate our carbon dioxide emissions is key. That's where the energy shift and energy efficiency come into play. But talking about climate change is just as important. Research tells us that a majority of the people in the US are concerned about climate change, but they are self-silencing because they're convinced they have the minority opinion. They are also nervous about talking about climate change because they're not confident they can talk about it correctly. So if we can empower the majority of people in the US who are already concerned about climate change to start talking with their friends and families, we can start to turn the tide on this misconception and really start mobilizing for change. Furthermore, if we can highlight collective, local, and existing actions, it will help us navigate to productive cultural mindsets. So collective solutions, it's important that the scale and scope of the solution match the scale and scope of the problem. Local solutions, such as focusing on things happening at the town, city, or state level, help people avoid the trap of thinking either too small or the overwhelming and politicized trap of thinking too big or globally. And existing solutions, these actions aren't always getting highlighted by the media and aren't in our national dialogue yet. Highlighting actions that are happening now or could happen now give people a sense of agency and a sense that this is a problem for today, not someday down the line. And one thing that we want to avoid is polarizing the situation. We did research in 2016 and 2017 after the 2016 election and discovered that sometimes talking about community level solutions can be polarizing. But fortunately, there are language tweaks that can help steer you clear of unproductive conversations. Instead of using the words politician, you can use the word civic or community leader. Instead of policies, you can use approaches. And there could be other examples as well. So changing our language to stay neutral keeps us from polarizing the conversation, which helps keep folks stay engaged and view this as a community level issue and see how to understand how the climate is changing, what the effects are to them, and how community level solutions will help us tackle the problem. So now we're going to talk about a solution in action. So this is an example from the Noki network about trees in cities and urban settings. So we'll read through it briefly. So we believe we need to protect our forest resources and increase trees in our urban environment to provide benefits to our community for the future. Trees and people are part of the solution. Trees planted in urban settings contribute to absorbing excess or rampant CO2 in the atmosphere. Urban trees also provide increased cooling in cities, filter air pollution, and soak up rainfall. Access to urban green spaces supports human health and equitable communities. Concern for the climate is normal, but action is happening all around us. You can talk with neighbors in your community to create tree stewardship programs and urban green space plans. And so again, I just want to highlight a few things in here that we have made sure to bring in the value again. So we believe we need to protect our forest resources. We also want to explain how they help reduce CO2. So they absorb the rampant CO2 in the atmosphere. And then they also provide co-benefits, such as cooling the cities, filtering the air pollution. And then providing a specific example of what people can do and including talking about it in that example. So that's just one way that you can create a solution in action. But you might be asking yourself, how do I do that? Fortunately, we have a toolbox of frame elements to guide you. So each of these icons represents a tool that helps convey part of the story. So again, we have the responsible the values, the how does it work, explanatory metaphors, and how do we improve the situation solutions. So we'll be sending you a follow-up document with links to videos, research, and blogs provided by Noki. Included is a template of how to create your own climate story using the 5 components of strategically framed climate communications that we presented today. We hope that you explore and use these resources to create your own framed climate story to share with your communities. And I think that we will drop that follow-up document in the chat in a moment. And so then just to close us out about Noki, there are links to videos, documents, papers, blogs that are all shared with you. And we welcome you to look us up online, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and explore training opportunities that we have available.